To understand polygonal modeling, I'd like to begin by comparing mesh and poly objects. Both are fundamental data types in Max and Viz. I'll begin by creating a plane primitive with one segment in each direction, just to keep this as simple as possible. I'll make it square by making it 12 feet in length and width. Turn off the grid, and I'll copy this plane off to the side and then make another 2 copies like this. I'll give these 2 planes a different color, and then select this plane, right click, convert to editable mesh. I'll convert this plane to an editable poly. This plane will get an edit mesh modifier, and this plane will get an edit poly modifier. Okay? So let's first talk about mesh objects that are shown in green here. This is an editable mesh, and we'll start by looking at the rollouts that we see in the Modify panel. I'll go to the Modifier version, and you'll see that it is missing one of the rollouts. The editable mesh has an additional rollout down here called Surface Properties, and this is used for subdivision displacement, a modeling technique that uses textures to displace geometry. I'll hold off on discussing displacement until we get to the texturing module. So for all intents and purposes, the editable mesh and the edit mesh modifier are identical. The difference is that the modifier version can exist in the stack, so it takes a bit more memory, but it can be more convenient at times. Historically, the mesh object is older than the poly, and it takes less memory to store a mesh than it does a poly. But you'll find greater and more advanced tools in the polys. So let's get on with our exploration, and we'll look at the editable poly next. Take a look at the rollouts that you see here. I'll go to the Edit Poly, and we'll see some different rollouts, and we are also missing rollouts. So it's a mixed bag here. The Edit Poly has Edit Poly Mode, and the Editable Poly doesn't have that, but it does also have these 2 rollouts. They're not present over here. So let me unravel this difference for you. The edit poly modifier is best used when you need to animate sub-objects because it has this overall mode, model or animate. Animate mode grays out any of the tools which are not animatable. Go back to model to have access to more tools, but many of them can't be animated. The edit poly modifier takes a bit more memory than its reduced cousin, the editable poly, which is a fundamental data type. Now the editable poly has these 2 rollouts. We already know what subdivision displacement does, something having to do with textures and modeling. And subdivision surface is something that I'll cover a little bit later, and it has to do with smoothing a low poly model and making it look more curved and more organic, which is really a fundamental part of polygonal modeling. So there you have it, your quick superficial tour of the differences between mesh and poly.